Welcome to another episode of AIJAC Insight. My name is Joel Burnie, and it's a pleasure to have you today. We have two distinguished guests with us today, Jonathan Harounoff from the Israel mission at the UN in New York, and Gabe Max, a former associate of the ambassador at the United Nations Permanent Mission for Israel in New York. And we are going to have a conversation today specifically about Jonathan's new book, about Iran and the women's life movement, but also more broadly about the activities over the past couple of years in the United Nations, which not only has been a huge task for the Israeli mission, but will also focus on what's been going on with the Australian UN mission as well. So Jonathan, pleasure to have you. Gabe, pleasure to have you in the studio as well. How's everything going there in New York, Jonathan? A busy couple of days?
Great to be with you, Joel. Good to see you again, Gabe, and thanks for having me on your show. It's been a busy couple of days. It's been a busy year, and yesterday, Monday, November 17th, was quite a historic day at the UN with the passage of the UN Security Council pushed through by the United States. That was essentially ratifying the second phase of the Gaza peace plan put forward by President Trump, and 13 member states of the Security Council endorsed it, and 2 abstained, Russia and China, and there were zero vetoes or votes against. And it's essentially heralding the next phase, the much thornier phase of this agreement, which is centered on what happens next. How do we disarm Hamas? Who disarms Hamas? What does that process look like? And how do we demilitarize Gaza in general and make it a safer place for everyone?
So it's a very important resolution yesterday, and we're going to get onto that a little bit later. But as I can hear from your accent, there was obviously a great story as to how you go from living in England to being the spokesperson for the United Nations, the Israel United Nations mission in New York. So can you tell us a little bit, Jonathan, about your journey as to how you've got to where you are today, and what was the pathway of getting you there?
Sure, I'll keep it brief. My mother is Israeli, my dad is British, and my grandparents are Iranian background. So I've always been interested and attached to that part of the world. Grew up surrounded by the languages, the cuisine, the culture has always been a fascination to me. And I studied at university a combination of Arabic, Persian, Middle Eastern history, journalism, moved to the United States with my now wife 8 years ago to pursue graduate studies. And after graduating, took on a couple of roles in corporate communications, journalism, and with great fortune and luck and some hard work, was able to get this position at the Israeli mission, where we're doing really critical work, working with extraordinary people from all over the world, whether it's inside the Israeli mission, people like Gabe from Australia and people from England, the US, Israel, of course, all focused on holding the United Nations to account when it falls short of its goals and representing Israel at the global stage of the UN, because however one feels about the United Nations, it still dominates and attracts global interest, as we saw with the passage of the UN Security Council resolution earlier this week. And that's something that we take very seriously, and on a day-to-day basis, we're there representing Israel, fighting the fight, good fight, and carrying that torch.
So we've got your book. It's Unveiled, Inside Iran's Women Life, Freedom, Revolt. So given your background, what was the motivating factor? And we'll go into the content of the book shortly and a few themes from it. But what was the motivating factor to sit down and start writing this book?
Well, there was, of course, the personal attachment to the region, hearing stories, my grandparents, my relatives, what growing up in Iran was like. And what started to emerge was a sort of parallel here, an interesting phenomenon that I don't think is touched upon enough in mainstream media or in general conversations. And I'm referring to the growing the massive gulf that exists between the 92 million people of Iran and the 46-year-old Islamic Republic of Iran. And the people of Iran definitely don't share the same views of the Islamic Republic when it comes to relationships with the West, the United States, Israel. And I wanted, as someone who's trained as a journalist, I wanted to tell those stories that aren't really being told in the media. You see plenty of stories about the Islamic Republic's nuclear weapons program, about the negotiations around that, about the proxies, about its dangerous and expensive foreign policy. But you don't really see many stories about the people of Iran, inside Iran, who they are, what they feel, from different age groups, generations. And of course, there's a good reason for that, because there are access issues. But I had, over the process of 3 years of writing this book, I had the opportunity to interview Iranians inside Iran and in the diaspora to learn more about their experiences under the regime. And the book's writing very much coincided with this massive, historic, women-led uprising that took place inside Iran in September 2022, following the killing of an Iranian Kurdish 22-year-old woman who was killed at the hands of the country's morality police. And the book talks about the massive woman life freedom movement that followed her brutal killing and sort of its ramifications and its legacy 3 years on in a post-October 7th Middle East. And those are some of the themes that I try to touch on in the book.
And so what the book does is it connects those, societal dynamics, women's rights, youth and social media, but you connect them with the geopolitics, Iran's role in international relations. Within the context of trying to link those two, but focusing on the societal response, why do you think that the brutal killing of Mahsa Amini was such a catalyst and trigger for what appears to us and what ultimately became one of the most fierce and strong revolts against the regime since it came into power in 1979?
Sure. Well, the first thing that's important to note is that this wasn't the first major revolt to have taken place in the Islamic Republic's 46-year history. Before then, there were a series of uprisings, revolts taking place. If you look at the 1999 student protest, the 2009 Green Revolution, 17, 18, 19. But I think in answer to your question, Joel, what I think really resonated and really struck a chord with so many people inside Iran and in the diaspora was, in my opinion, the fact that Mahsa Amini was an ordinary person. She wasn't a politician. She wasn't an activist. She wasn't looking for attention. And she just happened to be, unfortunately, in the wrong place at the wrong time. She was about to matriculate to university. She was visiting Tehran with her relatives. And she experienced something that thousands of other women inside Iran had experienced before, where they were accosted by the morality police. They were berated. Some of them were arrested, or much worse, as we see with Mahsa Amini's experience. And I think that sort of shared experience was something that resonated with many people, but also the fact that she was so ordinary and it could have happened to anyone. That, combined with the massive use of social media inside Iran, and the use of slogans and hashtags and music and art and culture, these tools that are much harder to control for the sort of more traditional Islamic Republic, I think helped really amplify this movement and spill internationally. And that's why you saw so many solidarity rallies worldwide. You saw so many people, cutting off their hair in solidarity. It's why in Israel, one of Israelis inside Israel, one of the first groups to show immense solidarity and pride to the Iranians protesting. And I think there are a number of very interesting reasons that we could go into if you like. And I think it's not only because both groups have experienced terror at the hands of the Islamic Republic, whether it's directly or indirectly for Israel with the proxies and the direct missiles, and of course with the Iranian people, but also more positively, the Iranians and Israelis and Jewish people have a very shared, intertwined, positive history of collaboration, of cooperation that has been completely forgotten about in the past 46 years. preceding the Islamic Revolution of 1979, much of the 20th century was characterized by very positive relations between these two countries. If you look at the founding of the State of Israel, David Ben-Gurion often spoke about the periphery doctrine, where Iran played a very central role in Israel forming alliances with, as you saw, an Arab sort of bloc emerge against Israel. Israel went to countries like Iran, like Turkey, like Ethiopia to try and bolster relations with those countries. It's why Iran became the second Muslim majority country in the world to recognize the State of Israel after its founding in 1950, following Turkey. It's why you saw these unofficial diplomatic missions established in each respective country's capital. There was a long history of allyship that I think many Iranians and Jewish people and Israelis are attached to and remember. Even and sometimes, unfortunately, with the broader world, it gets overshadowed by what we've seen for the past 46 years.
So let's drill down on that a little bit deeper. So you raised the utility of social media, which allowed for certain things to happen that may not have been allowed to happen in 2009 Green Revolution, for instance. So if you can give maybe one or two examples as to specific things that occurred during the revolt itself with the utility of these new communication messages and how that was able to get maybe what was a dormant demographic charged and energized to go out into the streets. And I am also interested, as a follow-up to your point, about the role that certain Israeli activists played to assist the movement, or potential for even more involvement from Jewish organizations who have Iranian origins, or remember of the good old days of that the strength of the bilateral relationship between Israel and Iran predating the revolution of '79.
Sure. It's actually interesting to know that even in 2009, there was it was one of the first viral moments in the Middle East that really sparked a massive incident, and that was also there was the killing of a young woman who was shot, who was killed. Her name was Neda Aka Sultan, and her gruesome death was also captured on very grainy phone footage, and it led to this massive uprising and outrage, but the sort of capacity and universality of social media wasn't where it was in 2022. And I think that's one major factor that led to the Women Life Freedom uprising really metastasizing. But if you're asking for one interesting example, I would point to what became the unofficial anthem of the Women Life Freedom movement. And there was he wasn't particularly well known outside of Iran, and was sort of well known because he competed in a sort of a pop idol equivalent show in Iran. His name was Shervin Hajipour, and he published this song called Baroya, which loosely translates as "because of," which is essentially composed of dozens and dozens of tweets by Iranian people who were each sharing reasons for their grievances towards the Islamic Republic, whether it was because of the environmental plundering, the brutal oppression and violence, the mismanagement, the gender inequality, all sorts of reasons they were listing. And what Shervin did was he collated them all and put them into a really captivating song, and that everyone could listen to. And even if you don't speak the language, it's very catchy. That became the unofficial anthem of the movement, and almost any other act of defiance or protest had that song attached to it. Everyone was sharing it with Telegram, Signal, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, whatever. Some of them were using VPNs to circumvent government restrictions and blackouts. So that was one real example of social media being used to galvanize this movement. And and in answer to your second question, you saw, I think the Iranian Jewish community in the diaspora and also Iranians in general in the diaspora play a tremendous role, because they're essentially the connecting tissue between what the outside world sees and knows and what's going on inside Iran. They've experienced the two, and they played a tremendous role back then, and I think they'll continue to play a tremendous role because they have personal attachment to Iran's future, and they want what's best for the West, and they also want what's best for inside Iran, and they're one of the major groups of people to make sure that people aren't confusing the Islamic Republic for Iran and for the Iranian people, and that's something that they try and do time and time again. And there are even small things that seem insignificant or small when people describe the Islamic Republic or the regime as the Iranian regime, or when they're saying that IRGC stands for the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps when it stands for the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. These things may seem minute, but it packs a lot of meaning. To those people, there's nothing Iranian, which spans thousands and thousands of years, Persian civilization. There's nothing Iranian about the 46-year-old Islamic Republic. And these groups of people in the diaspora are one of the main groups of people to sort of illustrate that message.
So I want to talk about the younger generation in Iran, and I guess it feeds on to that point. This is a generation that has no living memory of pre-79 Iran. It has lived entirely under the regime as it currently is. In terms of the book and of the revolt itself, what role did the younger generation play, the Gen Z generation? And how important is that in the context of perceived weaknesses inside the regime? Meaning, the student uprising of '79 greatly assisted in the overthrow of the Shah in the revolution. The students played a massive role in that. Is something similar happening with the same age cohort now? Is this a threat or a large threat to the regime, this younger generation and their response to the revolt itself?
One major parallel that we saw between what happened in 1979, which was a transformative episode in modern Middle Eastern history, and what we saw in 2022, 2023, was that both movements were able to attract vast swathes of the country's population. In 79, didn't just attract religious fundamentalists, it attracted people from across the spectrum, and the same thing happened with the Women Life Freedom movement. But the young people, especially the women, play a very critical role, because in the eyes of the Islamic Republic, when they see a woman, whether she's young or not, protesting, ripping off her head covering, singing, dancing, that is seen as an existential threat to some of the core pillars sort of holding the Islamic Republic together. And some people are of the opinion that what we saw with Women Life Freedom in 2022 was a sort of isolated incident. I'm of the opinion of quite the opposite, that women have been in a 46-year sort of battle against the Islamic Republic, a 46-year quest for freedom, because from the Islamic Republic's very inception, they've waged war on women. One of the first measures that was put in motion by the founding father of the Islamic Republic, by Khomeini, was the subjugation of women, the imposition of the mandatory hijab. And within weeks of the Islamic Republic coming to being, March 8th, 1979, which was International Women's Day, you saw hundreds of thousands of women take to the streets and protest and say that this was not the revolution that we were promised, this is not in our name, and so on and so forth. And ever since then, you've seen women protesting in various forms. And what happened a few years back was just the latest incarnation of that, for sure.
If I could jump in about the youth.
Yep.
Yeah, go ahead, Gabe.
I think, and Johnny, you talk about it very interestingly in the book, that you talk about it in the book that the primary issue with a lot of this, the student-led programs like protests like the ones in 2009 and in 2022 is the decentralization and the disorganization. And the difference between, those more modern youth protests and the ones that occurred in 1979 were the other factions that were involved, the religious fundamentalists and the socialists and the communists, who did have a level of organization. what I found very interesting about the evolution of protests of people my age over the past couple of years is the sudden appearance of organization. So you look at the protests in Nepal, in Bangladesh. These were incredibly effective protests that actually overthrew their governments. And casting minds back to 2022, there was no organization sufficient enough to actually regime change, which I'm sure we'll get into later. But I feel like for my age, the climate and the level of understanding and knowledge of what is necessary has begun to shift. And the Islamic regime is not the government of Nepal and it's not the government of Bangladesh, but it doesn't take much to bridge those organization gaps.
Yeah, it's a great point. I do think, though, there is some intentionality to the decentralized nature of many of the protest movements that you've seen inside Iran. And there's a good reason for that. The fact is that in 2009, the Green Revolution was sort of centered around an opposition figure. That was the time of the disputed, or some say rigged, presidential re-election of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. And you had this opponent emerge, someone who was seen as a favorite, Mousavi. And what the Islamic Republic did once they saw that he became really popular, this one single leader, was they just isolated him.
Mm-hmm.
They put him under house arrest, and he's still under house arrest to this day. And I think had in 2022 one leader or two leaders emerged inside Iran, you would have run the risk of the Islamic Republic just isolating them, disappearing them, or even executing them and then taking the whole sting out of the entire movement. So there was some, I think, effectiveness to the decentralized nature that made it more universal, more accessible, but also much harder for the regime to pinpoint.
Mm-hmm.
And even though there are perks to doing that, then it also has the same issue that you're alluding to, that it sometimes can be disorganized. It's sort of united in its opposition to the Islamic Republic, but it's not necessarily united in, and it could be fragmented in terms of what should come next or what its message and its mission really is. So there are definitely pros and cons to it.
So, Gabe, you raised it. It's on everyone's thoughts in terms of, what happens from now. And I guess the only option that's there is the question of whether or not these type of protests have a big enough destabilizing factor to potentially bring forth the breakdown of the regime. Now, many would say, well, hold on, why can't protests have incremental change or pursue policy change? And I'll get your take on this, Jonathan, but I'm assuming that we can, that there's no real movement for this current Iranian regime to make the lives of women any more free than what they are now. So in terms of what you've written in the book, the connections between Iran's geopolitical instability, especially now post the June war, what do you see on the horizon, given the successes of the previous protests, the changes in the communication methods, the strength of certain generational demographics? Are we seeing or witnessing enough fragility inside Iran for there ultimately to be regime change, or we're just not there yet?
I think you're right in what you said a bit earlier on, that there is a general understanding and recognition that the Islamic Republic isn't going to reform. And 2022 was probably the turning point, that point of no return. And people were no longer protesting to reform the Islamic Republic from within, but to bring about some kind of wholesale change. I would say that the Islamic Republic now is very vulnerable, but it's not on the brink of immediate collapse, as some may say. And I think doing so runs the risk of underestimating the task ahead. It's one thing that it's been weakened militarily, and its nuclear program has been set back as a result of the 12-day war, operations Rising Lion, Midnight Hammer. What I would point to, which is a much greater existential threat to the Islamic Republic, is what the domestic situation from within. And the people inside Iran are increasingly disgruntled, not for political reasons, not for ideological reasons, but because the country is facing a debilitating water crisis that is going unaddressed. you're at a point now where the country's president, Masoud Pezeshkian, said that Tehran could essentially run out of water. Tehran is a massive megacity of 10 million people, and its rivers and its lakes and its dams are taking their last breaths. You've got 19 of Iran's major dams, which is roughly 10% of the country's reservoirs, completely drying up. And the Islamic Republic, and this is a result of decades and decades of mismanagement, corruption, over-planning, reallocating resources away from inside Iran to arming proxies, building expensive nuclear weapons programs. And the people of Iran are noticing this. So I think so long as this goes unaddressed, which it really is, the people of Iran are going to rise up, and it's only a matter of time because we're talking about their lives at stake. And they're also seeing the messaging coming out from officials. The officials are not really saying that they're going to deal with this. Over the summer, they accused Israel of moving the clouds and being responsible for this water crisis. Iran's now in its fifth consecutive year of drought. And more recently, some of their clerical leaders have said that this is God's punishment because of the women who've gone about Unveiled, and also because of the government officials who haven't enforced this stringently enough. So they're not actually addressing the problems on the ground. They're making a lot of excuses, and it's only, in my opinion, a matter of time that the people are going to rise up once again.
Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I've noticed since the June war a massive uptick, at least on my social media feed, of footage from the streets of Tehran and other major Iranian cities of unveiled women, of street performances. In particular, I see a lot of punk music, which I found very, very interesting. And the sense that I've been getting, and Johnny, I'd love to hear if you agree, is that since the June war, not only is there an acceptance that the Iranian regime will never reform, but there seems to me to be an air that there is a sense of inevitability now inside Iran, and there sort of always has been in much of the ardent Iranian and Jewish diaspora, but now also inside Iran, that a major decline or a major collapse is sort of not imminent, but inevitable, and people seem to be kind of bracing and preparing for that advent. Do you think that's true?
I think there's definitely been growing defiance, not just since 2022, but since the 12-day war, absolutely. Even though Israel's objective in that preemptive strike was not to bring about regime change, but to eliminate an immediate existential threat, I think it definitely emboldens Iranian people to sort of begin to take their own destiny in their own hands. But there are definitely severe risks in place. And even though you see that footage of people singing and dancing in the streets with their hair uncovered, that definitely is happening at a much greater degree, but the consequences are still there. Right. There are still risks. The morality police are still around, and people still do risk arrest. But you are seeing an amazing amount of courage out there and bravery by men and women who are sort of growing increasingly tired. And I think what happened in June did play a role in them acting out more bravely, but also recognizing that the Islamic Republic is in a position of weakness and doesn't care about them, and perhaps we'll see something soon.
So what's the next step for the Women Life Freedom movement? Where to from here in the short term?
I think even though the Women Life Freedom uprising didn't ultimately succeed in its goal of bringing about immediate change, I think the embers are still there. People are still defiant, people are still protesting, and it's only going to take another sort of spark, another incident to trigger something much greater. So I think the movement itself will evolve, but so long as the domestic issues go unaddressed, now it's water, there was gas and electricity shortages, subjugation of women, lack of minority rights, all of those things continue to go unaddressed. It's only going to bubble up and boil up and explode at some point. So we're probably going to see some other form of unrest. It will probably be an extension of the Women Life Freedom movement, but it may take slightly different form.
Okay, Jonathan and Gabe, I'm going to pivot now to more broadly United Nations issues. Gabe, you spent a year at the Israel mission in New York at the United Nations. Tell us just very briefly how you go from Yavna graduate, head of AZYC, to sitting in the corridors of the United Nations with Jonathan and others.
Sure. I was at the Israeli mission to the UN as the senior speechwriter from July 2024 to 2025. Like a few other Yavna graduates over the past 10 to 15 years, I signed up for an internship, a 3-month internship at the mission. I arrived there with, after a few complications and delays with my visa and security issues. I arrived in the last few weeks of Ambassador Gilad Erdan's tenure as the ambassador. When I arrived, the speechwriter I was supposed to be interning for had actually left, and they asked if I would fill in the interim, and that's what I did. And then a few weeks into that, internship / acting employment, Ambassador Danon came in and began his second term at the UN, and from his arrival, I continued to write the speeches except for him rather than Ambassador Erdan. And when it came to the end of my internship, I was honored to stay and remain in the full-time position as the speechwriter for the ambassador and then for the senior diplomats until I returned home to Australia back to university.
What surprised you and didn't surprise you while you were there for the year?
What surprised me, what didn't surprise me was the hostile environment. That's pretty obvious. We all, anyone with a general understanding of Israel and its relationship with the world and the international society understands that the UN has always been a hostile place. It's sort of baked into the walls. 193 member states, most of whom are authoritarian and have an ingrained social, cultural, religious hatred for the Jewish state. But what surprised me most is the positivity and the camaraderie within the Israeli mission itself. It was incredibly comforting and incredibly heartening to see and experience and be a part of. As I'm sure Johnny can continue to attest is the case. It is a wonderful environment to work, and the sense of teamwork in facing down, the barrel of that diplomatic shotgun is very comforting.
So I'm going to ask a question to Gabe, but I'm also going to bring you in on this, Jonathan, because you might have a little different take. Now, Australia's behaviour at the United Nations has been highly publicised since the start of the war, through changing previous positions on resolutions, to adopting or supporting resolutions for an immediate ceasefire that didn't mention Hamas or didn't call for the release of the hostages before ceasefires. In 2024, our foreign minister was trying to build a coalition of like-minded nations to support the recognition of the Palestinian state. There was more activity, a huge amount of activity this year while you were there. So what did you see, and what were your perspectives of Australia's behaviour at the United Nations while you were there?
I can take it through chronologically, because the first instance in which I really saw upfront the drastic change in the Australian position was during the opening of the General Assembly in 2024, when Foreign Minister Penny Wong came, and her slew of meetings were with countries that had kind of dedicated their efforts at the General Assembly to kind of isolating and demonizing Israel's defensive actions. And in the course of those meetings had joined in on the chorus and had adopted much of the same rhetoric, which was jarring to hear from an Australian foreign minister, speaking in the same breath as some of those nations. And then that continued into December, which is when a majority of the General Assembly resolutions are passed. They come up through the subcommittees into the General Assembly. And it was shocking to see and to hear of Australia changing long-standing positions on several recurring resolutions against Israel. It's common knowledge that a majority to say the least, of General Assembly resolutions are directed at Israel, or of those that are directed at specific countries are directed at Israel, and many of them are recurring resolutions that are passed every year. For example, one of the resolutions was about water rights in the West Bank, accusing Israel of diverting water, and Australia had always voted no, and I believe this year, and I think in the year before it had abstained, and now it had voted in the affirmative of that resolution, among many, many others, including the ceasefire resolution, which made no mention of Hamas. And that sort of continued, and then seeing, from afar, I was still involved in the mission at the time, helping out a little bit with the speeches, but seeing this year during the high-level week, this year's opening of the General Assembly, hearing and seeing of Australia's active involvement in the movement of the recognition of a Palestinian state, and really, doing everything at its disposal, or doing many things at its disposal to put the heat onto Israel, was again shocking. But it all
they weren't just pursuing their own policy of recognition. They were trying to get other nations to recognize Palestine as well.
Yes, Australia is playing an active role in that cohort of countries attempting to convince other countries to recognize a Palestinian state.
Why do you think it's such a priority for the Australian government to do that?
I think there are a few reasons. Firstly, there is no better place to score easy foreign policy wins than the UN. Foreign policy wins domestically. There's a very funny scene from the British political comedy Yes Minister when they go through voting against Israel at the UN, but they can't explain it. The only reason is it's just easy. There's no problem with it. You get to score political points both domestically and at the UN. You're taken a bit more seriously in the environment. You're seen as a country that gets on board with the agenda, and of course that helps with accomplishing things that you want at the UN. For example, a Security Council seat, which Australia had from 2013 to 2014, and appears to want again. So there is very, very little political capital expended to criticize Israel at the UN, especially when compared to the political capital that can be gained by criticizing Israel. So I think it is very much a numbers game from my perspective that the Australian government is playing, which is incredibly disheartening and devastating as a proud Australian and as a proud Jewish Australian to see that happen.
So, Jonathan, as a senior member of the team at the UN, what Gabe says is a very strong and united team at the Israel mission, with countries like Australia, potentially other like-minded countries, Canada, the UK, France, and others. How have you seen a shift in their behaviour in the United Nations, and how has that impacted the work that you and Gabe were doing, or you are doing and Gabe was doing at the mission at the UN?
Gabe laid it out quite perfectly, but I would like to echo some of the concerning scenes, disheartening scenes that we saw, especially September, August of 2025, around the time of High Level Week, all the countries and their representatives coming to New York. And many of those countries sort of using their elevated platforms not to bring about tangible peace, but to use it to make these sort of statements of recognition that are sort of detached from reality and that go from A to Z without filling out the middle stuff. And that's something that Australia was very much at the forefront of. And it was I think it was very much some interesting thing that it was an indictment on sort of where the UN is in terms of its role in bringing about real peace, because during that time you saw a lot of commotion coming out of the UN. We were involved, but it was over Rosh Hashanah, so our involvement was also fairly limited. That's a separate conversation. But all of these countries using their platforms, Canada, Australia, Ireland, so on and so forth. And, when the dust settled after High Level Week, there was still fighting in the region. Hamas still held all the hostages. Israel was still at a state of war with Hamas. the only real action, the only real time you saw action take place was after High Level Week at the White House, with the UN very much on the sidelines. When President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu unveiled this, what's now known as the 20-point peace plan, and sort of names the UN and playing a tangential role, but it's, as the premier place for global diplomacy, for peace building, peacemaking, peacekeeping, you would have expected the UN to play a central role. And because it provided this platform for these sort of discussions of statehood and these empty statements, as opposed to like actual peace building, bringing about peace, releasing the hostages, saying what Hamas is, and these kinds of things. That's why the UN is in the current state that it's in. And it was very disheartening at that time to see Australia play into that, because it was also the similar time where news emerged of the sort of real culprits behind the anti-Semitic attacks inside Australia. And they didn't use really their platform to talk about that. The fact that I remember in August of 2025, we suddenly saw all of these reports, intelligence reports linking the Islamic Republic to the arson attack at the cafe in Sydney and the synagogue in Melbourne. This is another country, another member state of the UN, being actively involved in Australia, committing these horrific acts of anti-Semitism, and there was no word by the Prime Minister about this, or the Foreign Minister about these horrific acts. Instead, there were these empty statements that didn't really lead to anything. So I think that's sort of my assessment of Australia's disheartening role in the past couple of months, and also the UN's role, that it has a tremendous amount of potential and Israel wants to have a seat at the table, but it sometimes squanders its resources and its potential, and as a result you see that like real peace building and real steps are taken outside of the UN, with the UN on the sidelines, and that's not necessarily the way things should be, but that's the reality.
So let's use that potential as the bridge to the final question. So just in the past 24 hours, we've had the codification of that 20-point Trump peace plan adopted by the Security Council. So both Jonathan and Gabe, I'll go to you first, Jonathan. If you can give us but leveraging off what you've just said about potential, is there a potentially positive outcome coming from the Security Council adopting this resolution over the past 24 to 48 hours?
The positive outcome of this resolution is that it allows us to unlock essentially the phase 2 of this agreement. Even though we're not completely done with phase 1, there are still hostages, 3 hostages as of the time of recording, whose bodies still haven't been returned, when they should have been returned within the first 72 hours. But it unlocks the next much more difficult stage of talking about how do we actually disarm Hamas, how do we demilitarize Gaza, how do we actually take steps towards peace. And I think for many of the sort of mediating and involved parties in the region who agreed to President Trump's peace plan, they wanted this stamp of approval by the UN, by the Security Council. So it's important in that respect. And like with any agreement, any negotiation, there are compromises to be had. Right from the outset, even though Israel was very supportive of President Trump's 20-point peace plan and his administration's tremendous efforts to bringing home the hostages, this agreement involved concessions. It involved, in the first phase, the release of convicted terrorists, people with terrorists with Jewish, Israeli, American blood on their hands. But that was the price Israel had to pay. And with the next phase, it's also involving certain concessions. And as we better understand the exact contours of this agreement, what it's going to look like, what the plan in place, what the Board of Peace is going to do, we'll have a better understanding of where we are. But it's certainly a positive step that countries, certain member states, permanent member states, didn't veto the resolution, and that we're actually able to move forward towards peace.
Gabe?
It's very interesting, firstly, watching from here in Australia again, the first sort of really major UN resolution regarding Israel since I left. But it was very relieving to see that this went through in the form and the language that it did. Of course, as Johnny said, major concessions have been made, but overall, this seems like an incredibly or a potentially positive, a potentially incredibly positive point for Israel. I think the motivations of many states on the Security Council shouldn't be sort of contorted. I think that they're all kind of witnessing the decay of the international order that sort of governed the world after World War II, and moving towards more of a multipolar world power sort of situation that existed before the UN. And there is immense fear in that, justified, but we're in that situation largely because of the UN's actions itself, that it couldn't get out of its own way, that it couldn't work effectively with the mandate that it had, and it is at risk of being left behind entirely and finding itself in a League of Nations-esque sort of situation if it doesn't get on board with the direction. And this plan that President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu put forward is the direction the region is going, and there was a necessity in order for the UN to maintain a semblance of relevance that this get passed, even if the language wasn't to the liking of certain permanent states on the UN Security Council. Johnny, would you agree with that?
I would agree. And you don't always have tremendously positive news coming out of the UN, but yesterday was one of the more positive days. And we hope and pray that we have more of those to come, because there's a lot of darkness that comes out of the UN, a lot of demonization, delegitimization. And if we want to be on a more constructive path towards peace, something akin to Abraham Accords, and if the UN wants to play a central role in that, I hope and pray that we have more of those days in the days ahead, the months ahead.
Well, that's quite a positive note to end off. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Gabe.
Thank you, John.
Jonathan, we wish you the best of luck with the book, and we hope for brighter days ahead, specifically for the Iranian people, but most importantly, the women of Iran. Thank you, Jonathan, for your time. We wish you the best of luck with your continued efforts in what is a very tough environment at the United Nations in New York. And Gabe, thank you very much for your input today. Happy to have you back in Australia, but always keen to hear your insights of what was and sounds to be quite an amazing 1 year away in New York. So thank you both for your time today. And that wraps up another episode of AIJAC Insight.